Hi, and welcome to this PowerShell tutorial. This is actually a video request from David Morgan, and he was actually in the stream on Saturday, May 28th, I believe. Yes, May 28th. And his question was how to process certain JSON outputs that we get. We often get JSON from API calls, and that was his example. So he actually provided me with an example of the JSON that would be provided back from the API that he's working with. I couldn't get direct access to it, but I really wanted to use his example in this as well, just because it's a little bit more complex than some of the APIs that I have access to. It might just be useful just generally for how to process JSON, whether that be JSON files or returns from API calls, since the majority of the time you're going to be getting back JSON from those API calls. So what we're going to be looking at here is this example JSON file. And so this is the response that he would get from his API. So we have values here, which are actually the rows of data in the database that he's querying, the status of the call, the columns, so these are the column names in the database, and then the number of events that came back and omitted events. So we're going to go ahead and look at how we can see all these different values, how we would work with JSON in PowerShell. So this will be a little bit more of a deep dive of just working with JSON in PowerShell. And I'm actually going to go over two ways to actually do what he wanted. So what he wanted to do was rebuild this database basically in a PowerShell object to be able to query it easily and just be able to get more information. So there's actually two ways to do this. There's the way that you're going to see if you go look at the video on demand on Twitch. I did it one way, but actually further thinking it through, I found a different way to do this, and it's quite a lot easier. So David, if you're watching this, I would probably actually go this route. It's a little bit easier. It's not as complex, and actually the amount of efficiency is a lot higher in this one. So if you're ever dealing with like large data sets, this would probably be beneficial. All right, so let's actually go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is get our response back. So this would typically be through an API call, of course, but in our case, since we are using an example, I'm actually just going to be fetching our JSON from the file. So let's just go ahead and fetch that here. So I'm just going to run that. And here is our JSON that we get back. So we're just going to make sure that we get it back correctly. And that looks pretty good. So the first step, as soon as you get JSON back in PowerShell, I would first transfer it over to a PowerShell object. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a variable called response object. And we're going to make that equal to response pipe to convert from JSON. And if we run that here and we look at our response object, we are going to actually see everything that we saw in our JSON, but we are now going to see it in a nice PowerShell object format. So we have values, status, columns, matching events, and omitted events. And what this lets us do, it really lets us use that dot notation that PowerShell is known for. So if we want to see all the values, which is actually the rows, we get all the rows here. If we want to look at the number of matching events, we just do matching events, and we can get the number of matching events, which is 3. Perfect. So what we want to do is we want to rebuild that database. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is, of course, grab the rows and grab the columns, because we need those values in order to rebuild it. So we're going to grab the rows and we're going to make that equal to response object dot values. Now the reason why I know it's rows and not the exact values is actually if we do response object dot values dot count, we actually see that we get 3. But when we just look at the values, it does look like we have 6 values, but it's actually only 3 because each row is its own cell uh, in that array. As we can see in the JSON, they are all self-contained. It's an array of arrays. So it's just a nested array. So we know that each value or each entry in that array is actually an entire row. And then we have our column. So we're going to make that equal to response object dot columns. And that we know is just the columns and they have a property of name. So we can run that here. And then the first method, which is actually going to be the method that I don't really recommend, but it does work. It's a little bit more complicated and probably has a little bit more overhead on it as well. But first, we're going to create our export variable, and we're going to make that equal to a array list to store our data in. So we're going to make that system.collections.arraylist, and we're going to make that an empty array list. And then what we need to do is we need to go through each row and add each row for each column. So the way that I would do this is first start by looping through each row. So we're going to do for each row in so for each row index in 0 dot dot rows dot count minus 1, and we're going to open and close curly brackets. So what this is going to do, if we actually just run this really quickly, we have row index. So if we run this, we are going to see that we get 0, 1, and 2. So we know that the arrays start at 0, and then the count is as if you were starting literally from 1. So we have a count of 3. So we need to go from 0 to 2 in order to get all those items. And then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating an entry right here. So that's going to be a new object, and that's going to be a type. The autocomplete did not like me there. So that's going to be a type name of PS object. And then what we're going to want to do is now we are going to want to loop through each column in order to create that object with the 2 columns, or the 2 properties in our case, and we're going to be assigning the row values in there. So we're going to do a for each column index in 0 dot dot and then a variable wrapper, and then columns dot count minus 1 for the exact same reason as we did above, just to get each column. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do an add member. The input object is going to be entry, and then the member type is going to be a note property. The name, we are going to set that to columns, and then we're going to make that a column index. So we're referencing the column index that we are at, and then dot name. And then we are going to go ahead and put in the value, and we're going to put this value as rows, and we're going to do that as it's going to be rows index and then column index. So we're going to do a row index because as we know, it is a nested array here. So we're going to do rows, row index, and then the column index. Perfect. That should be good. And then after that, for each here, we are just going to go ahead and do a export dot add, and we are going to add our entry. Just fix this here. entry, and then we are going to actually just display our export variable. So let's just run this real quick, and this should work here. And I forgot to put the $sign in front of the columns. All right, so there it is. There's that table that we built. So we had our two columns, IP and server, and then we have each of our rows. So the 169.198.1.1 not exists. 8.8.8.8 is Google. 1.1.1.1 is Cloudflare.com. And if we just go to our example, we can see that those are our rows, and we can see that those were our column names. So and this is completely independent of the matching events. Now you could do, instead of the rows dot count -1, you could do the matching events -1. But this would mean you're definitely counting on that API call to give you that correct amount of matching events. And just because I couldn't really validate to make sure that the matching events always match the number of rows, I'd rather just use the actual number of values that we get back and use that. But as we can see here, if we actually just go ahead now and add a array in here, and we just do 0.0.0.0, which is a very nice IP address, and we just say YouTube test is the server name. So if we save that here, and we just go ahead and we run that, we get our table just fine. So it definitely works properly with any number of rows that we have in there. So that is the first way to do it. And like I said, this was the way that I initially thought of it, which the first way that you think of something might not always be the best. And that's why I'm actually giving both ways, giving the way that you guys will see on the Twitch live stream if you guys go back to that video on demand. But also I'm going to give you a slightly improved version that I thought about shortly after the Twitch live stream. I wanted to make sure to include it in this video. This way you guys get both solutions, and depending on the scenario that you guys have, like maybe you guys don't have to rebuild the database. In this case, my next example probably wouldn't be as useful, but I just want to show all the different things that you could do with JSON objects. So in order to rebuild that database, we can actually use another type of object. And that object, instead of being an array list, is actually going to be a data table, which probably already makes more sense for people to use. But we're going to do an export, and we're just going to say export table is going to be this variable name. And we're going to set that to a new object, and we're going to set that to system dot data dot data table. Now we have seen these before, but we've mostly used them in our GUI example. We've actually never used them for just coding scripts to display data, but I figured that this was actually a very good time to use those. So what we're going to be doing now with this data table is we're going to be adding our columns. So what we're going to first do is we're going to do export table dot columns dot add, and we're going to add a range of columns. Since we have an array of our columns, we can add a range, and our range is going to be columns dot name, because we know that we actually have a name since our columns, if our columns variable isn't just the name of the columns, although it is, it's actually an object and it's got a property of name. So we just want to make sure that we just pass in the names, because if we just do columns.name, we can see that we just get a nice array of just the names, and that's what it's really expecting. So we have columns name here. So if we actually just run this right away and we look at what is inside the export table, we're going to see nothing really shows up because we don't have an entry in there yet. But what we can do now is we can actually do a for each, and we're going to do for each row, in rows, so this is a little bit more what we're used to seeing, we can actually do export table dot rows dot add, and we can add our row. All right, and then let's just go ahead and let's just output that export table. So if we actually just run this code here, I think I might so there you are. So one thing about the rows.add, you're actually going to get an output every time that you add a row. So what I would honestly do is just do a square bracket void in front here and a square bracket void in front here as well, just to avoid any unnecessary outputs to the screen. And now if we rerun it, you're going to see that we get a very, very nice output of our table that looks exactly like what we did up here, but much, much more simplified. So this is a lot easier to read, a lot easier to understand going back to your project compared to all these different indexes, using all these different counts, creating an object, adding the object to the array list. Here it's just very, very straightforward. You're creating a data table, you're adding the columns, you're going through each rows that you're getting back, and you're adding the rows in the data table. Now, the only important thing to note that this is definitely taking into consideration, of course, this API call, which has the column names in the same order that we're returning the values. Of course, if they weren't in the same order, this would probably be a lot more difficult to do. I would find it very weird that an API would give you the columns and the values in different orders. But this is pretty much PowerShell and exploring different JSON. So really the main takeaway here, and I know I've mentioned it before already in my PowerShell intermediate series, but when you're working with JSON, always do the convert from JSON. You're going to get a PowerShell object, and then you can go back to your PowerShell scripting methods and use the dot notation. And then this is just a very cool way to convert what you're getting back into some sort of usable data table to easier filter through your results. And I mean, you don't even have to be querying a database to want to build a database from your results. You might have some data in some of your API responses that would make sense to create objects for each entry that you're getting back and create PowerShell objects for each one, and then be able to search through those objects very quickly with a where clause, and then output those to files or insert those into databases through the SQL module. So that is pretty much it for this video. So again, this was definitely a collaboration on Twitch. So I would definitely recommend, if you can make it out to those Saturdays, it is between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Times. I'm usually coding in Unity lately on those because I'm trying to learn just some game development and learn the Unity engine. But if you guys have any questions regarding to PowerShell or anything that we've really done on this channel, I will stop what I'm doing and I will try to answer you directly on that live stream if I can. And that kind of just works my brain a little bit more, and it kind of shows you the process that I go through to solve a problem, and that itself is probably a lot more useful than some of these tutorials. Just because you can see the thought process and the problem breakdown that I go through. So always make sure to check that out. I will have a link in the description down below for my Twitch channel. Again, it's every Saturday from 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you guys have any comments or questions about this video or any other topic, PowerShell, C#, anything programming related or systems related, let me know in the comments below. If I have the answer for you and it's a little bit more specific, I'll answer you directly in your comment. If I find that it could benefit a lot of people, I will make a video just like this one. And this way you can see it, and the whole subscriber base and viewers can benefit from it as well. So make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and hit that notification bell to be notified when that next video comes out. And I will see you guys on the next video.